So some of today's objectives are really understanding how identity, translanguaging, which I'm sure that some of us are in varying familiarity with that term. So hopefully we can bring some awareness and insight into what that term means for our practice, how this all intersects in terms of your classroom practices and establishing a sense of belonging for students. We're going to analyze some student-created artifacts for really looking at insights into their linguistic, their cultural identities, the ways that they situate themselves in their social world. And we're going to apply some of these art-based strategies to really understand how we can support heritage language maintenance and culturally staining pedagogy through a sense of belonging in our classroom. So we're going to practice it a little bit through the activity, and then I'd love to hear more in the future about how this maybe gets implemented in different classrooms. So let's frame the activity a little and understand kind of the context in which we were, in which we're all situated. TESL and really, multilingual education or language education is really shaped by an increasing degree of cultural and linguistic diversity around the US, especially in the Southwest, where myself and my research context and participants were located. There's a, increasing number of students who are being designated as English learners or emergent bilingual students who are coming into school with a really wide linguistic repertoire that's not always perceived as valuable for schooling. English is often framed as kind of the sole language needed for schooling. And so these students may often feel excluded or unwelcome in certain contexts based on those factors. Increasingly, there's a lot of fear around immigration enforcement and detention, something that my colleague Ashley was just talking about in her previous talk, which was more focused on mothers, right? But this also really affects students who can be apprehensive, shut down, not as engaging, or maybe not as present in general in terms of absence, right? Especially in culturally sensitive contexts like learning language. And so, really being present around mindful around how students are present in our classrooms in this given context. Finally, looking at how TESOL teachers can really support students' sense of belonging, their sense of being accepted and welcomed, and that they can bring their full self into their classroom and into the school. And one way that we can do this is by centering students' multilingual, multicultural, multimodal identities, right? All of the different ways that they situate themselves within their world, seeing that as a large holistic overlapping, messy kind of example of who they are rather than simplifying identity. And we'll get into that a little bit. So this is some of the context. The conceptual lens that I bring to this activity, and it was relevant in my larger study, but really this activity is one way that I was able to dive more deeply into translanguaging and identity. So that's kind of the conceptual lens or framework that I used for this activity. And one quote that I really love that I think we can continue kind of reflecting on throughout the talk today is a language does not necessarily equal an identity, right? And so, students, especially bilingual, multilingual students, language equals identity in this very linear format might not really be the ways that they express themselves or position themselves in the world, right? So we really are going to be considering how students describe and represent languages in different ways, especially languages with which they may or may not have an ethnic affiliation, right? So not only students for whom Spanish or Mandarin are heritage languages, but also students where they're not heritage languages and looking how do they connect that language to their identity. One way is also how students express, a sense of relationality or affinity or kind of ownership over language. And so those are other examples that might come up in the drawings. And so we got to be able to unpack those. One of the key foundations of this conceptual framework is translanguaging, right? I'm sure that some of us maybe who are more familiar in TESOL contexts or engage in research or maybe have gone through, teacher preparation programs in the last 10, 15 years, you're probably more familiar with the concept of translanguaging, but essentially this stance, this orientation views languages not as separate or discrete or countable kind of objects where you have your English proficiency separate from your Spanish or separate from your Hebrew or your Mandarin proficiency or whatever it is, but rather these are all part of one unified kind of linguistic repertoire, and we employ different features of different languages at different times from this single repertoire to achieve particular aims, right? So that could be the ways we use language in certain ways, in certain contexts, is really relevant to what we think we should be doing, whether we're going to stick entirely to English, or maybe we're going to translanguage and introduce some Spanish into our talk, or kind of go back and forth ways that might be of were traditionally kind of framed as code switching, but rather than viewing these as distinct codes that we consciously switch back and forth from, a translanguaging perspective views these languages as more of collections of features that we have socially named a given language and decided there's a boundary between this and another language. So we're kind of complicating that. And you'll see that in students' drawings and in their expression, it's not always so clear cut as we might imagine it to be. Here, we're really focusing on what's often called pedagogical translanguaging, where it's consciously used as part of an instructional strategy, right? We're consciously trying to get students to feel free enough to use language in all of these different ways and use all of the different features of their linguistic repertoire in the art activity. Whereas oftentimes other activities or other assessments may be limited to an English only assessment or a Spanish only assessment, for example. So we gave students free reign, free linguistic reign, as it were, right, to use things, features that kind of were most meaningful to them. So we'll get into that. The next element of the conceptual framework is identity, right? So really looking at the connection between identity and language. And one really important thing to get across or to take away is that identities are not fixed or singular traits, right? The idea of having a certain ethnic or national identity, being white, being Jewish, for example, two of my identity pieces, being a monolingual, raised in a monolingual household, right? Or being a sequential multilingual. These are different elements of my larger identity, and they kind of overlap with each other, as we'll talk about in a second. And these are also shaped and reshaped through constant ongoing interaction, right? As I go throughout the world, my understanding of what it means to be a white, Jewish, male, academic working in, academia and the institutions, how I'm positioned in different ways and how I respond to that and navigate that world is through language, right? Using more different ways of languaging in different contexts, right? And now we're seeing that sometimes it's more appropriate maybe to use translanguaging even in academic contexts and conferences or in emails or other things. So using our linguistic resources, so not only standardized English or Spanish, but different dialects, different styles, different slang varieties to position ourselves in different ways. And that's how we portray our identity, or how we kind of want to be perceived, whether we're conscious of that or not, to the outside world. In doing so, in using language to kind of put ourselves in a certain position in relation to others, right, we're either challenging or sometimes reinforcing dominant social norms in terms of, I see myself in this way, and that could either kind of go with dominant norms or it could kind of push back on dominant norms. So being, more of a, having more of a critically conscious perspective could kind of go against dominant norms, and that will show up in terms of how you position yourself, for example. We don't need to get too deep into theory around language and identity, but I do want to mention as well the concept of intersectionality when we're looking at these artifacts and looking at ways that students portray themselves and their identities, is that we don't really have one singular identity That's the center of our lives that these other identities kind of rotate around. But these are overlapping layers or overlapping identities, right? So our race, gender identities, socioeconomic class, our heritage language, right? So being like a Yiddish heritage speaker, and identifying more with that than with Hebrew, even though that's kind of a common language used in different Jewish communities. Our sexuality, these are all different identities that overlap, intersect, come together, and mesh in these unique ways that create assemblages where you can have different layers of discrimination or marginalization and privilege embodied within the same person. And we have to be mindful of that as we're looking at how students portray their identities and how these identities overlap and create these, unique assemblages of being from some privileged backgrounds, but also being from other marginalized groups and seeing how students put that together rather than how we expect them to put that together. And so that's one of the benefits of the activity that we'll be able to talk about. So, more briefly, translanguaging and identity for students, youth, emergent bilingual youth has been really frequently studied in US schools. These students are often found to blend linguistic features in both written assessments and multimodal assessments in terms of talking or writing or presenting, presentations or writing poems, whatever it is. When students have the opportunity to do that, they often take advantage of that. And I witnessed that as well in a separate activity where students responded to a translanguaging journal, and many of them used that practice in the journal activity. So students are using these language practices, and pushing them out of our classrooms also does not help create a sense of belonging and welcoming for students to bring their full selves, right? They use these kinds of language activities to forge alliances, tell stories with one another, reject certain kinds of stereotypes about how language should be used. And it's our duty to embrace and uplift the translanguaging practices of our students and also of ourselves and our peers. I know that the research also discusses how bilingual teachers will often experience linguistic shaming for translanguaging in their classrooms, right? Whether spontaneously or more as a conscious pedagogical strategy. So we really need to create a community within our classrooms and our schools that these are accepted, valuable, embraced language practices that really speak to the more complex ways that we make sense of our world. And we can kind of see that in the image here of the students want to help me make un castillo, right? Kind of blending features of English and Spanish to make meaning. This is a prominent practice that we should be tapping into, and this activity is one way to do that. So, um, beyond the theory that kind of framed the design and the desire to create the translanguaging activity, this is an example of arts-based pedagogy as well as arts-based research, right? So integrating artistic methods and artistic ways of expression, creative expression, right? Drama, dance, visual arts in the case of the drawing activity, digital arts, I'm sure would be a great space to explore this, integrating that within curriculum and instruction. So in this case, this activity was done during the English language arts time, which was actually imagined to be a monolingual class space for English only, despite the trilingual model. And so we kind of intentionally designed it during that period. Arts-based pedagogies really help students develop more creative understandings of different topics and issues that are affecting them through a range of practices that foster language learning, they foster collaboration, critical thinking, because you're asking students to think outside of the box, not write a 5 paragraph essay or, an argumentative essay or however it is, but you're really giving them more creative reign to say, this is how I want to express my understanding. And this is frequently used with emergent bilingual students, students with a range of language proficiencies, because you're really giving them control over how they show their learning rather than expecting it to be through typically an English monolingual or maybe even a Spanish monolingual um, assessment model. right? So these are really great practices. Um, This activity in particular is multimodal arts-based pedagogy, right? Because meaning isn't just made through language, but it's the connection of all of these different semiotic resources or meaning-making resources. So language, image, as well as gestures, right? Or sounds that students could make, or movement. That's why drama, role-playing, simulations are such impactful learning styles because we're bringing so many different methods for students to make meaning. Spatial design is really important in terms of where things are placed on the image, and we'll talk about that a little, as well as digital media, right? So choosing to use an emoji versus writing out a word in a text. Now we're getting into multimodality. Um, so that's important to keep in mind that students are writing, they're drawing, students used feathers and fuzzy balls and googly eyes and all of these things to make meaning in some way of their art pieces. So finally, to really kind of frame the justification and kind of perspective that I bring to this activity, if translanguaging invites us to reconsider what counts as language and whose language practices are legitimized in schools, right, which is very much a translanguaging stance, then multimodal arts-based pedagogies compel an equally important rethinking of what counts as literacy, what counts as knowledge, and what counts as legitimate classroom participation. And we're going to be talking about that and thinking about that as we look through the student artifacts, right? Giving students more ways to express their learning. So, moving to the context of the study, like Dr. Fonis was sharing, I conducted a critical ethnography of a trilingual charter school in Arizona called Desert Language Academy. It's a pseudonym, um, primarily serving an affluent English dominant student population in a pretty well-off suburb in Arizona. The school began as a private school, private trilingual school, and as they grew over maybe 3 or 4 years, they decided to become a public charter school. So that was one kind of strand of my research was looking at the construction of the school as this elite, prestigious space that's now a public charter school, but also looking at the experiences of students and teachers within the school who are learning in English, Spanish, and Mandarin throughout the day. So there was a very complicated language allocation policy in terms of what the percentage of English, Spanish, and Mandarin instruction should be for different grade bands. But overall, less than 5% of the school, the students were designated as English learners. So very few English learner designated students, which is partly due to Arizona's very restrictive English only policy context. It's also due to other factors like the school's recruitment and branding, other pieces that I'm continuing to write up about. So stay tuned for that. But the school was predominantly attended by white and English dominant students, which led me to characterize it as a one-way world language model. So, being that this is a TESL context, very few students were actively learning English as an additional language that wasn't typically used in their home. But we're still looking at multiple different angles of language acquisition, language education. Trilingual education is very rare in the United States, especially in a public charter context. So my research is going to continue looking more at how students and teachers and families navigate these types of schools. But I do think the activity is very relevant for all different kinds of language learning contexts. So here we see the 16 student artists who are the 16 participants in my study. But we're really focusing on four students' artifacts: Ethan, Jamie, Teresa, and Zoe, the students who are highlighted. We can take a second to look through. And all of these students completed an art piece, so the larger paper will include a wider range of students beyond just four. So this is an overview of the translanguaging and identity activity, which was collaboratively created between myself and Miss Contreras, who is the English language arts teacher at the school. And you'll actually see her drawing at the end because she also created a drawing. And I encourage teachers faculty if you're using this in a teacher preparation instance, to create your own drawings as well. So we discussed this activity and named it "Quién eres? Nishi Shui? How are you? Who are you?" Sorry. So that's kind of the theme of this activity is who are you? And we included some examples here of different ways that identity and sense of belonging and sense of self can be represented through art. We also showed a couple of short videos. But I would say to select pictures and imagery and videos that are really relevant to your context, that are relevant to your students, your community. And that might take some time in terms of talking with other teachers or talking with school leadership, maybe looking in the community to see if there's any art or murals or things that could be brought into the classroom that students might recognize. But these are some examples of art pieces that we showed them. So here's the prompt for the activity. The students had 2 hours spread over 2 days. So they had 70 minutes on the first day, 50 minutes on the second day, and most of them attended the second day. A couple didn't, but most of them did. And after showing them pictures and kind of having a brief discussion about the ways that um, artists have reflected themselves or shown themselves in their art, we gave students this exact page as their prompt. If I didn't know you and I couldn't see you, but I want to get to know you, what would you draw or make to tell me who you are? So that was the prompt that we gave students, and we also gave them this list of examples, your cultures, family history, languages you know, family, friends, pets, places, foods, clothes, all of these different things. We tried to keep it really expansive, and we try to give them a sense of security by saying this is a private activity. You don't have to tell anyone else what you're drawing or making. When we get to the different ways to extend the activity, we can kind of talk more about that. But we try to give students really free rein to draw, write, create anything that made sense to them to tell us who you are. So we didn't purposely ask them, please translanguage or please mix languages or whatever way we could frame it for them to understand that concept. We really just said whatever languages you know or want to learn, anything at all. If a student asks, does it have to be in this language or that language, say it's entirely up to you, or you get to make the decisions. Because we really want students to use whatever language or languages are most meaningful to them. And we saw that students really did that without us even necessarily prompting them, besides showing it as an example they could include. So this is the prompt. And briefly, before we move on to analyze some of the artifacts, I've done my best to try and de-identify them by putting little blocks. So if you see kind of a block that seems out of place, it's covering some identifying information. But also just consider the following as we analyze these images, right? Thinking about symbolism, the ways that imagery can represent feelings or affiliations, right? Like flags or foods that students might identify with or might connect to their nationality, which languages are used, which aren't used, which are left unpresent or left invisible. How are languages used? How are they positioned on the page? How are different things positioned in relation to one another, in terms of size or in terms of color? What's important or what's meaningful to these students, right? The prompt says, tell me who you are. So we can assume that what they're writing on here is something that's important to them. And I didn't have the opportunity to individually interview every single student, asking them about their drawing, but during the activity, Ms. Contreras and I were circulating. We were asking questions, trying to learn more, not trying to guide the students or steer them in any direction, but being there for them. One student asked me, Mr. Corey, I'm Mexican and American. Which one should I draw? And I said, that's entirely up to you, and draw it however it makes the most sense to you. And she ended up drawing a flagpole, a single flagpole with a Mexican flag and an American flag below it. And that was the way that she represented that. So thinking a little outside the box or symbolically is very good for an arts-based pedagogy. So this is the first piece of art. The student's name is Ethan. He's a sixth grader. That's a pseudonym. He was in sixth grade, and we'll just give a few minutes, take maybe 60 seconds just to look through the image before I share some of the things that stood out to me in my analysis. If you have any questions, you could put questions in the chat as well during this time. Awesome. So, one of the things that drew my attention in terms of, he has a lot of colorful drawings of, Aries, autumn. A lot of the students put their astrological signs, colors that he likes, artists, the Mortal Kombat symbol, right? Video games, shoes. A lot of students put things that were meaningful to them, but um, maybe don't tell us as much about how they situate themselves in terms of their national, linguistic, ethnic relations to the school or to each other or to languages or communities. But a lot of students put different iconography of, who they are from those types of identity perspectives. So here we see um, the number 5 greater than European. I'm not quite sure what that means, to be honest. It might be something from an ancestry test. There's a few other times where the plus or the greater than symbol is used. Maybe that was kind of a meme for these students at the time. But I do see him drawing a Mexican flag and an American flag. And the Mexican flag is positioned more to the left. So, assuming that the image is typically read from left to right in English, um, he's positioning it kind of first. I don't think that necessarily means he views it as more impactful to him in his identity, but that also is aligned with how it's often phrased, Mexican American as a hyphenated identity. So, maybe that's what led to him. But those will be interesting conversations of how do you balance those two identities, or knowing that different students, right? The other female student I mentioned as well, chose to symbolize both of those flags, but on a single flagpole. That could be an interesting point of discussion, or a point of reflection if you're trying to learn more about these students. Something else, everything is essentially written in English across the whole page, except for one phrase, and I assume we can see the cursor. One phrase here, kind of more in the top center of the image, 我说zhang wen, I speak Chinese. And it's written in a mix of Mandarin characters and also pinyin, the letters above here. And so it says, I speak Chinese, and it has an exclamation point at the end. And so that was something that stood out to me, not only because it's kind of hidden or doesn't really stand out as the brightly colored kind of writing at the top and the bottom, but um, Ethan is from a mixed Mexican and American heritage. Mandarin's not part of his family's, language background or history. So I wonder why he included that exclamation point, or why he chose to say, I speak Chinese, but he doesn't mention Spanish anywhere on the page, or Espanol, or anything that would kind of, he has elote, but nothing that really identifies Spanish or Mexicanness or Latinidad as, a salient part of his identity based on this image. And so if you were using a follow-up where you're going to meet with students one-on-one and chat with them about their image to get to know them more, that could be a potential question to ask. Well, how do you, what languages are most important or meaningful to you? And then you could see how they respond, and get to learn a little bit more about them. So if there's any comments or thoughts about the image, feel free to leave them in the chat, or things that you're noticing. Um, in the interest of time, though, I want to move forward to talk about a few of the other students. Right. And so we're also seeing here language and also imagery being kind of used together. So I think that's really interesting how the flag is drawn, the ways that things are written. That's what I'm looking at as I'm um, investigating the image. So let's move to another image. This one was created by Zoe. She was in 3rd grade at the time of the study. I enrolled a mix of 3rd grade and 6th grade students. Um, and so I'll give you all maybe 30 seconds to look over Zoe's image. Awesome. So, one of the things that's important to know about Zoe is she's one of the few students at the school that comes from, at first at all, a Chinese ethnic background. Most of the students were white and English dominant, where Chinese was not part of their family's heritage language. But for Zoe, both Mandarin and Cantonese were part of her multilingual household. One of her parents was from mainland China, one of her parents was from Hong Kong. And so she brought a wealth of knowledge not only about Mandarin but also Cantonese and sort of the differences between them. And this was very seldomly integrated into classroom instruction. But here we see that the first language that Zoe uses, if we're starting kind of from the top left corner, where our eyes are naturally, in my opinion, often trained or kind of conditioned to go, the first language says, um, ni hao in Mandarin. Well, it could be Mandarin or Cantonese. They're written using the same characters, but pronounced slightly differently. So I think she's starting with that language. I think that's a very impactful thing maybe to follow up on or to know about Zoe was that um, this language was very meaningful to her because then we go to hello and then hola. And so she's putting Mandarin first, whereas oftentimes English would be placed first in terms of descriptions of the school. I might have even unconsciously said, English, Spanish, and Mandarin. And that was often the arrangement of how the school was described. So she's kind of flipping that on its head by putting Mandarin and Cantonese or really centering these Chinese characters first. But we see a lot of other icons or symbols in the image that tell us something about who Zoe is and how she views herself, right? So we see that she loves Wonder Woman, but also Great Wall, which is an indicator, a geographic kind of feature from China. So that term is meaningful to her. Um, we see other pieces, friends, family, her faith, which we also saw in Ethan's drawing, that students' faith was really meaningful to them. A lot of them put their year that they were born. Um, she also drew here a flag of Hong Kong in the right corner, right? She didn't draw the flag representing mainland China, like the red flag with yellow. Here she chose to draw the flag of Hong Kong. And in other instances, she sometimes positioned herself more from that sort of identity that pushed back on the flattening of Mandarin and Cantonese and Fujianese, all of the different linguistic diversity in China, flattening this into Mandarin equals Chinese, and that was the term that was frequently used around the school. So, her bringing Cantonese and bringing a Hong Kong sort of identity into the school and into her classroom, I think reframed that narrative. She also drew a bottle of soy sauce. She drew a bowl of presumably noodles with chopsticks. So some of these other kind of stereotypical or characteristic images that someone might associate with Asia or with China, but that she also identifies are meaningful parts of her life and identity, assuming this is, also a popsicle and a lollipop. So it's all of these different things that are meaningful to her, but the ways that language and flags and food are kind of represented, I think is really impactful in Zoe's drawing, even though there are sometimes, a lot on the margins here. And again, if anyone has thoughts or comments, I'm happy to see them. This is the last student example that we'll be looking at. And this is Teresa and Jamie. So Teresa's drawing is here on the left, the larger one, and then Jamie's is over here on the right. Teresa and Jamie were cousins, and they're both Navajo. Jamie's family is actually Navajo and Apache, and Teresa's family is Navajo. And they're members of the same family who are the only indigenous family attending the school during my time at the school in 2022 to 2023. It's probably important context. So I conducted the study through all of 2022 and 2023, the academic year. So I was situated in the school for about a year. I was a classroom assistant. I was helping move furniture around. I was helping cut papers, helping in the office, helping during pickup, and being a yard monitor. I was a volunteer at the school while also collecting data and engaging in, interviews and learning from families and going to PTO visits at families' homes, and was really immersed in the school community for that year. So at this point, we conducted the activity in April of that year of 2023. So April of 2023, I think that's when it was. And April of 2024, sorry. And so it was 2023 to 2024. Wow, it's been such a um long time. So, anyways, it was towards the end of the academic year. So we had a lot of time to really build relationships with students where they felt comfortable to bring their full selves into their drawings. And this is really evident in Teresa and Jamie's drawing because so much of their identity as Indigenous students, Indigenous women, Indigenous language learners was really overlooked in the school through the trilingual model that prioritized, Spanish and Mandarin for English dominant students. And in interviews and other conversations, language and identity were important themes for both of these students. And so we see in their drawings, the one on the left, Teresa, spent the entire class period making this really accurate, detailed depiction of the Navajo Nation flag. And so the flag has four mountains, each depicting the four sacred mountains in four directions. The rainbow symbolizes Navajo sovereignty. She drew the seal kind of in the middle in the very vivid detail. And we see on Jamie's piece, she has it too. Maybe not the whole entire depiction, but she at least has most of the outline there. Whereas Jamie chose to include some other things, her birthday, other information that was important to her. Teresa really spent the entire period only focusing on this one image. And Jamie said to her, man, you really put your blood and tears into that, or your blood and sweat into that. And Teresa, who was typically very quiet, both students were often very kind of overlooked in their classes, which is part of a larger narrative of, kind of deficit framing towards these students. But she looked at Jamie and kind of gave her just this modest smile and went right back to coloring. And it was such a cool way to see that, this is such an important piece of Teresa's identity that was so often overlooked in the school, except in sort of tokenizing ways. And so this activity, I think, was a space for them to really feel a sense of belonging and also express that this is a meaningful factor for shaping our sense of belonging in the school. So that was just a really interesting thing to see, whereas a lot of other students maybe focused on sometimes more surface level factors of their identity, which all come together in a meaningful way, don't get me wrong. But I think there was something really special about the ways that these two students made a point to include their Navajo identity in the drawing in different ways. So very quickly, we'll look at Miss Contreras's drawing. So she made this drawing during the first day, and then also, I believe, finished it at home that evening and brought it back the second day. So not everyone's expected to do this. We definitely won't have time to get into a drawing like this today with a few minutes for our example activity. But Ms. Contreras was born and raised in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. And every morning she would cross the border as what's often called a transfronteriza student, right, crossing the border to go to school in El Paso, Texas. And she was schooled there predominantly in English only schools for K through 12 and went to college in El Paso as well. Her family ended up moving there in high school. And so this image really represents the kind of duality of that experience. We can see more Mexican traditional imagery on the right that was meaningful to her, and more American style imagery on the left that was meaningful to her as representing her life in the United States, right? Like the Mickey Mouse looking sun and McDonald's and cacti and other kinds of things. And she folded the paper very intensely to have a crease that kind of symbolized the demarcation, between the US and Mexican sides and how she wants to reconcile those identities. That's part of a separate article that I'll be writing with a colleague, Tipsuda, actually, at UNI. Um, But I wanted to show this as well because it's really important that teachers model these practices for their students and that we're also engaging in that type of vulnerability and reflection that we're asking of our students. So I'm not a very artistically super talented person as well. I play music, but I'm not, a super amazing artist. But I think it's the intention that you're trying to think about these things, and that could help you understand students' thought processes for what they're drawing as well. So if we don't have any questions, we'll move on to perhaps the most anticipated part of our activity of our session today, which is making our own drawing. So we have the same prompt. We'll take about 6 minutes, and if I didn't know you, which for most of us, I unfortunately don't have the pleasure of knowing you, and I couldn't see you, which many of us, I can't see you. I'm only looking at one or two boxes on here. We might have our cameras off, but I want to get to know you. I want to know who you are as educators. That's why this would be great for teacher preparation as well, who you want to be, how you want to approach your classroom, or more just about yourself in general. What would you draw or make to tell me who you are? So here's all these different examples on the side of things that you can draw. It doesn't have to be a cohesive image like Miss Contreras. A lot of the students kind of just drew things all over in sort of a collage. And remember, spacing is something to keep in mind, but we didn't tell them that. So whether you draw something on the left or the right or up or down is entirely up to you. But that could be something you reflect on. Like, why did I draw this bigger than this, or before this, or after this, or thinking about it in those creative ways? You can also write in the chat to describe something if you don't have drawing utensils. You could write a poem. You could write some kind of reflection that this is prompting for you. But right now, we'll take about 6 minutes to work on our mini activity. In the meantime, I'll play some calming music, and I'll be here drawing as well. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. And then after this, we'll have a few minutes where you can kind of hold up your drawings as well, and maybe a couple of us can share some elements of what we drew. Okay, so without any more talking on my end, we'll take about 5, 6 minutes and get drawing. Awesome. All right, I really appreciate everyone taking the time to um, draw, write, collage, whatever it was that was meaningful to you. I had some colored pencils here, was just drawing. And if we can maybe have one or two people, first, if we could just even show some of our pictures, that would be great. But if anyone wants to briefly share in a minute or two, a couple of the things they drew or how you would use this in your class. I want to be mindful of the time and make sure that we all have time to share. Maybe if you have questions or comments about how you would use it in your specific context. This was used with third and sixth grade students, right? So high school might look differently, younger, early childhood might look differently. We used it as an end of the year activity. You could use it as a beginning of the year activity or having students explain their drawings. But I feel we can jump into the discussion and just see if anyone wants to share or what you were going to draw. I know we didn't have obviously that much time, but yeah, I'll open it up a little. All right, Eliza sharing her drawing. Awesome. Some question marks. Other cool icons. Is there anything you'd want to explain or um, one thing you'd want to bring to our attention? Oh, wow, I love that it goes different ways. That's like very multimodal.
Yeah, so this bottom part has the mountains and ocean and trees of Oregon, where I'm from. And then on this side, we have, it turns out I don't know how to draw a tractor, but here, like some corn, the tractor, and like the flat horizon of Iowa, where I live now. And then I have, my babies, my kids here. I added the language piece around um, thinking about languages. But the question I started, you gave the instructions, and I was just like, question marks. That's all, like the very first thing that came to mind was question marks. So, um, yeah, so then I just kind of embraced that idea of like feeling a little between worlds sometimes or in two places. So, yeah, thanks for the
Totally.
opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. These types of activities, especially when you give students, sufficient time to really think about it, or if they want to start over, like you don't have to nail it the first time. But oh, that's awesome, Maria. That's great. Would you mind, is there anything specific you'd want to share about your drawing? Or you could even write it in the chat if you want. No pressure.
No, I was just drawing. I was just putting different family members, but having it symbolize different things and the love and spouses and children and education. Put it all in that in different symbols. So,
That's awesome. Yeah, I think doing this with adults would definitely be different in terms of like children and other things, but students often would draw, their families or their siblings or, right brother or those kinds of meaningful things. So tapping into that as well. You can draw your family and all of that type of stuff, I think is great. So, um, this can be used in a lot of really interesting ways, right? So having students use a protocol where maybe they go around and, remark on students' drawings, almost like a museum format, depending if students are open to having theirs included in that way. You could do the activity at the beginning and end of the year and then kind of discuss has anything changed for the students over time, or that could maybe be a really impactful research methodology in terms of doing this activity, maybe in different formats or different times with different students in different classes. Not that it's really meant for some type of experimental methodology, but just seeing, how students does the ways that students portray themselves over time change as they've maybe gone through a program or something like that. It would also be really great to pair this with efforts at family engagement, right? So maybe having families at school, the students are creating these types of pieces. Maybe their parents are doing their own and the students doing it and they're all talking, or maybe they're making a family collage together on like a piece of chart paper or something much bigger, right? Where they can kind of put all of that together. Maybe family members provide some kind of feedback on the art. Maybe they come to school to witness, a gallery walk of the students' art projects or having a showcase if this is maybe more of a impactful project that's not just kind of like a one-off activity. You can really build it into something much bigger, maybe connecting it to literature, connecting it to social studies activities, even science, if that's, some different ways of talking about family trees or something. But um, I find that this just has a lot of implications across contexts, right? Whether the students are 4 or 5 years old, whether they're teacher candidates in, a university or something. I think it's really relevant. And then you can kind of just fine tune it to students' needs. But the goal is really focusing on heritage language maintenance, right? Creating these inclusive and identity affirming classrooms where students can bring their whole self into the classroom, right? Teresa and Jamie, for instance, really focusing on their Navajo identity that was very overlooked previously. And so having more conversations about that from this art piece could be really meaningful to improve those students' sense of belonging or other students. So this is a really simple low prep activity. You don't need to be a well-resourced school to engage with something like this, but I think what's really important to keep in mind is identity is complex and messy, right? Kind of like Aliza alluding to with the question marks. It's not neat and fixed, and even if a student draws a flag with a Mexican flag and an American flag, that doesn't mean that they kind of equate those in their mind, and maybe that's something to reach into deeper, whether you're a researcher or whether you're a teacher.
Mhm.
So I know we have a minute or so, but as we leave, we could just be reflecting on how do you think you would use this activity? How might you adapt the activity to your context? Yeah, April says it's very versatile and could be a very fun activity. The students really enjoyed it, and the teachers did too. So I'll be around, or if you want to email me. I'm using my personal email right now because I'm in between institutional affiliations. So you could email me here. I'd love to hear, hey, we're doing this in my classroom. Do you have any recommendations or suggestions? I'd love to just see this how this plays out in other spaces. And I really appreciate everyone engaging and drawing some pictures. If anyone else wants to show, here I can stop sharing. If anyone else wants to show a picture of their um, drawings, that would be cool as we sign off. If not, have a great rest of the afternoon and thank you.